My name is Julian, and I'm a nurse in an old hospital, one that seems to carry centuries of dark stories in its corridors. I've always been a skeptic. I've never believed in ghosts or anything like that. But what happened to me that night changed everything. I was in my 3rd month of work, still adapting to the intense routine and the tired faces of the patients. It was a particularly quiet evening, almost too quiet, when I found myself in the cafeteria with Mrs. Carter, an old nurse of few words, but with a wisdom that seemed to overflow from her eyes. We were having coffee, and she seemed more introspective than usual. I plucked up courage and asked about what everyone avoided: the top floor of the hospital. From day one, I was told never, under any circumstances, to try to go there. "It's always locked for a reason," they said. Mrs. Carter looked at me, her wrinkled face seeming darker under the fluorescent light. She sighed deeply before speaking. "There are things that shouldn't be dug up, Julian. Stories that are not for the faint of heart." Her voice carried a weight that made the air seem denser around us. I laughed, trying to ease the tension. "Do you really believe in these things, Mrs. Carter? Ghosts and all that?" She looked at me seriously. "It's not about believing, kid, it's about knowing." She told me about disappearances, about the deathly silence that sometimes descended on the hospital, and about the shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Her account gave me goosebumps, but my curiosity only grew. The truth was that I wasn't just curious, I was obsessed. I needed to know what was hidden on the top floor, and it was this obsession that led me to act recklessly that night. After Mrs. Carter's shift ended, I stayed alone in the hospital, watching the constant stream of patients and nurses coming and going. The night wore on, and the idea of exploring the top floor wouldn't leave my head. I knew it was crazy, but something inside me, an uncontrollable need for answers, pushed me towards the locked door. I found the key in the principal's office. It was old, with rust that showed years of neglect. My fingers trembled as I gripped the cold metal. Every step I took towards the top floor seemed to resonate in my mind like a distant drum. When I finally arrived, I stood still for a moment, hesitating. But there was no turning back. I had to know. The door creaked open and an icy chill enveloped me. I took a step forward, and what I found on the other side would change my life forever. The next day, after a sleepless night, I was exhausted, but I couldn't get my mind off what I had found on the top floor. I needed more answers. During my shift, I started asking a few colleagues about the locked floor, but most of them quickly changed the subject or looked at me like I was crazy. It was as if the mere act of mentioning the top floor cast a shadow over the conversation. The only person who didn't run away from my questions was Mrs. Carter. In a moment of respite while we were alone in the cafeteria, I decided to try again. "Mrs. Carter, you know more than you're telling me. I need to know what happened on that floor." She looked at me, her tired eyes reflecting the cold hospital light. "Kid, some stories shouldn't be told, but if you're determined, I'll tell you what I know. Just don't say I didn't warn you." She began to tell us about the hospital's golden years, when it was considered one of the best in the country. Renowned doctors, innovative treatments, and a floor dedicated to advanced medical experiments. It was the pride of the hospital, until suddenly everything changed. Patients started disappearing and the floor was closed without explanation. There were rumors that the experiments had gotten out of hand, that something terrible had happened there. "I was here at the time," said Mrs. Carter. "I saw the changes. I saw the doctors coming and going with grim faces. I heard the screams that no one else seemed to hear. And then, one day, the floor was simply locked. It was never opened again." Mrs. Carter's words echoed in my mind as I returned to my shift. But that wasn't enough. I needed proof, something concrete to understand what really happened. I decided that I needed to explore further, to find someone who was willing to talk. That's when I remembered an older nurse, Mr. George, who had been at the hospital for decades. I waited for the right moment to approach him during a night break when he was alone in the corridor. "Mr. George, do you know anything about the top floor? Mrs. Carter told me a few stories, but I need to know more." Mr. George looked around, as if making sure no one was listening before speaking. "Kid, you're messing with dangerous things. But if you want to know the truth, look for the old files in the basement. They've been hidden, but not destroyed." That night, after everyone had left, I went down to the basement. The place was damp and dark, full of old records covered in dust. I started rummaging through boxes and files and finally found a map of the hospital. There it was, the top floor, highlighted in red like a warning. What I found in the old archives was frightening. Reports of unauthorized medical experiments, of treatments that had gone horribly wrong. Patients who entered the floor and were never seen again. Doctors who committed suicide after working there. These discoveries only fueled my need to know more. I was becoming obsessed, but I knew I couldn't stop. I needed to understand what really happened in that place. After finding those frightening files, my determination only increased. I needed to see for myself what was left on the top floor. So, one quiet evening, when everyone else was busy with their routines, I decided it was time to act. I found the old key in the principal's office, exactly where I had left it. My heart was beating fast as I climbed the stairs to the top floor. Every step seemed to echo in the empty corridors, as if the building itself was warning me to turn back. I reached the locked door and, with trembling hands, inserted the key into the lock. The door creaked, a sound that was more like a scream than a simple creak. When it finally opened, a cold, thick air escaped, making me shiver from head to toe. I took a step forward and was immediately overcome by a feeling of discomfort. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the air was impregnated with fear and suffering. The corridors were dark and covered in dust, with marks of abandonment evident everywhere. Cracked walls, broken light bulbs, and a deadly silence that made my own footsteps sound deafening. I continued exploring, passing old rooms and destroyed furniture. I found claw marks on the walls and furniture, as if something or someone had fought desperately. Each new detail only increased my anxiety and my desire to understand what had happened there. It was then that I entered a room that looked like an old operating theater. The equipment was rusty, with dried bloodstains in several places. The metallic smell of blood mixed with the old dust made me choke. In the center of the room, an operating table was still set up, with torn straps and dark stains. As I tried to process everything, I began to hear whispers. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the sounds got louder, clearer. Indistinct voices seemed to come from everywhere, words that I couldn't understand, but which conveyed deep anguish. I felt a shiver run down my spine when I realized that I was no longer alone. I looked around, but saw no one. However, the voices continued, and I could swear I saw shadows moving around the corners of my field of vision. It felt like something was watching me, studying me. I decided to keep walking, hoping to find an answer. It was then that I found an old photograph lying on the floor. On it were the faces of patients and nurses, all with expressions of fear and pain. Some of the faces were crossed out, as if someone had tried to erase their identities. I began to feel like I was going mad. The voices, the shadows, the oppressive atmosphere, everything seemed to want to swallow me up. But I knew I couldn't stop there. I had to keep going. I had to understand. As I continued to explore, I came across a room full of old cupboards. The doors were partially open, revealing dusty papers and files. And files. I became curious and began to rummage around, hoping to find more clues as to what had happened on that floor. Among the papers, I found a document that appeared to be a report on medical experiments. The descriptions were detailed and disturbing. They dealt with experimental procedures on patients who were considered lost by conventional medical standards. The doctors were attempting radical cures, but the methods were horrific and unethical. Reports of tragic failures and patients who were never seen again increased my sense of dread. Further on, I found a room full of destroyed furniture and broken medical equipment. The walls bore claw marks, as if someone or something had struggled fiercely to escape. The floor was covered in debris and dark stains that looked like dried blood. The feeling that something terrible had happened there was almost palpable. As I scanned the room, I heard whispers again. They were coming from everywhere, and it seemed as if the walls were talking to me. The sounds were so clear that I could almost understand the words. Help. Pain. Fear. The whispers blended into a chorus of despair that sent shivers down my spine. As the whispers got louder, I began to feel a presence. Something or someone was there with me, but I couldn't see it. Shadows danced on the walls, and I felt like I was being watched. My heart beat fast, and my breathing became heavy. But despite the growing fear, I kept going. It was then that I came across an old operating theater. As I entered, the air became colder, and a strong smell of iron took over the place. In the center of the room, there was an operating table covered in rust and dark bloodstains. Surgical instruments were scattered around, many of them also stained with blood. The scene was macabre and seemed straight out of a nightmare. In a corner of the room, I found a diary. It was the diary of a doctor who had worked at the hospital decades ago. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but still legible. I started reading, and what I found was horrifying. The doctor described the experiments he had carried out, the brutal procedures, and the catastrophic failures. He talked about patients screaming in pain, about his desperate attempts to justify his actions in the name of science. The diary ended abruptly, with the doctor confessing his regrets and mentioning something about them never leaving him alone. The last line was almost illegible, but it sounded like a warning. They are here. With the diary in my hands, I began to feel a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. The whispers got louder, and I knew I was no longer alone. Something was with me on that floor, something that didn't want me to find out the truth. After reading the diary, my feeling of being watched intensified. The cold hand I felt on my shoulder seemed like a clear warning to get out of there, but my curiosity mixed with fear pushed me to continue. The atmosphere was so heavy that it felt like the very air was pressing down on me. Every step I took through the dark corridors was accompanied by a growing feeling that something was wrong. I began to see shadows moving around the corners of my eyes, disappearing when I tried to focus on them. The voices, now clearer, whispered my name. Julian, Julian. It was as if the building itself was calling out to me. I passed a room that looked like an old infirmary. The beds were turned over, the mattresses torn, and the walls marked by deep scratches. The white curtains were yellowed by time, swaying slightly as if moved by an invisible breeze. On one of the beds, I saw an old wheelchair, rusty but still functional. Out of nowhere, the chair began to move on its own, creaking from side to side. My eyes fixed on a wall covered in old photos. Most of the pictures showed patients and hospital staff, many of whom looked eerily familiar. One face in particular caught my eye. It was the doctor whose diary I had found. He was surrounded by patients who seemed to be in agony, their eyes fixed on the camera with a look of pure despair. As I approached the wall to examine the photos more closely, I felt a presence behind me. I turned around quickly, but again there was no one there. The feeling of being watched was so intense that I could almost feel the weight of the invisible eyes on me. I kept walking, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. I found another room, which seemed to be some kind of office. On the table, I found more old documents describing even more horrific procedures. Among them was a drawing of a patient strapped to an operating table with notes detailing the suffering inflicted during the experiments. As I read, I felt an icy chill surround me. I looked up and saw a long, indistinct shadow moving slowly down the corridor. It didn't seem to have a definite shape, just a dark outline that floated across the floor like thick smoke. The shadow seemed to be calling me, and even though I was terrified, I felt an inexplicable need to follow it. I followed the shadow to a room at the back of the floor. As I entered, the door slammed shut behind me. The atmosphere was even colder, and a feeling of absolute dread enveloped me. In the center of the room, there was an old photograph on a broken picture frame. It was a picture of a group of patients and doctors, all with terrified expressions. I felt the cold hand again, but this time it was firm, holding my shoulder. I couldn't deny it any longer. Something or someone was definitely with me and wanted me to know it was there. The feeling of a cold hand on my shoulder paralyzed me for a moment, but I knew I had to keep going. I needed to understand what was going on. Heart pounding, I looked around the room for more clues. It was then that I found a pile of old diaries and reports on a rusty metal shelf. I started leafing through one of the diaries, and the words I found were pure horror. The doctor who wrote it recounted the experiments they were carrying out on the top floor. The procedures were inhumane, involving invasive and painful treatments that often resulted in the death of the patients. They justified their actions as necessary for the advancement of medicine, but it was clear that they were going too far. On one of the pages, the doctor described an experiment that went horribly wrong. A patient, a young man in his 20s, had undergone experimental surgery to treat an unknown disease. During the procedure, something went wrong and the patient started screaming in pain. The screams echoed through the corridors, but no one came to help him. The young man died on the operating table, and his spirit never found peace. As I continued reading, I began to realize that the doctors who carried out these experiments were also affected. Many of them went mad, tormented by the voices and visions of the patients they had tortured. Some committed suicide, unable to bear the guilt and fear. The final pages of the diary were almost illegible, written in a trembling hand. The doctor talked about deeply regretting his actions and how the patient's spirits wouldn't leave him alone. He mentioned seeing their faces everywhere, hearing their screams even in moments of absolute silence. The last diary entry read, "They are always with me. There is no escape." I closed the diary, feeling a crushing weight on my shoulders. I left the room and continued walking through the corridors, each step taking me deeper into the macabre history of that place. It was then that I heard the screams again. They were loud, desperate, and seemed to be coming from all directions. I ran towards the sound, driven by a mixture of fear and the need to find out the truth. I reached a small room at the end of the corridor, and there, in the middle of the floor, lay a mummified body. It looked like it had been there for decades, the skin dry and the bones visible. I recognized the face immediately. It was the young man described in the diary. Next to him was an old photograph of the group of doctors and patients, all with terrified expressions. As I picked up the photo, I felt a wave of cold pass through me. The screams became louder, more desperate. It was as if the tormented souls of the patients were trying to communicate with me, wanting me to understand their pain and suffering. The reality of that place was worse than any nightmare I could have imagined. The top floor of the hospital wasn't just a forgotten place. It was a tomb full of restless spirits and horrible memories. I knew I needed to get out of there, but something was stopping me. I needed more answers. I needed to fully understand what had happened. After finding the mummified body, my mind was in a whirlwind. Every sound, every shadow seemed to whisper terrible secrets. But even though I was terrified, I knew there was still more to discover, so I continued to explore. ignoring the growing dread that tightened my chest. As I walked, I began to see visions. At first, they were just quick flashes, distorted faces, bloody hands, empty eyes watching me. But soon the visions became more vivid. I saw patients in hospital beds, writhing in pain, begging for help. Their voices were full of despair, and their eyes reflected a suffering that I couldn't fully understand. One sight in particular struck me deeply. I saw a young nurse, her face covered in tears, holding the hand of a patient who was screaming in pain. The scene was so real that I could almost feel the heat of her tears and the cold of the patient's hand. The vision only lasted a few seconds, but the pain and suffering it conveyed was almost unbearable. As I tried to push the visions away, I realized I was in a room I hadn't noticed before. In the center was a dusty old tape recorder. Turning it on was an impulse I couldn't resist. The tape started spinning, and a voice full of anguish filled the room. It was the voice of a doctor, describing a procedure that had gone horribly wrong. He spoke with regret, his voice trembling as he described the screams of the patients and the failures of the experiments. The hallucinations intensified. I saw figures that disappeared when I tried to focus on them. I heard footsteps echoing through the empty corridors, and I felt invisible hands touching my skin. Each sight, each sound seemed more real than the last, pulling me into a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. The nausea and dizziness increased with every step. It was as if the air around me was poisoned, slowly suffocating me. My vision blurred and I began to stumble, my mind struggling to keep reality and the hallucinations separate. Finally, I reached a room that seemed different from the others. It was an old office, with dust-covered furniture and papers scattered everywhere. In the center of the desk was an open letter written in shaky handwriting. The words described a final plea for forgiveness from the head doctor, confessing all the horrors committed on the top floor and asking that his actions never be forgotten. As I read the letter, I felt a stronger presence than ever. I looked around and saw shadows moving along the walls, slowly approaching. Each one seemed charged with pain and suffering, reflecting the horrors they had experienced. I knew I had to get out of there before the hallucinations swallowed me completely. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't just abandon the tormented souls who were still trapped in that place. I needed to find a way to do justice, to give a voice to these forgotten victims. With the letter still in my hands, I decided that I had to keep going. Each new discovery, no matter how horrible, seemed to push me closer to the truth. The weight of the spirits around me intensified, and I knew that I needed to fully understand what had happened there in order to find some form of peace. I continued exploring the top floor, passing through dark corridors and rooms full of macabre memories. In a small, locked room, I found a rusty cupboard. With some effort, I managed to open the doors, and inside I found the mummified body of a patient. The sight was horrible, but I couldn't look away. It was clear that he had been left for dead, forgotten by everyone. As I looked at the body, I began to hear whispers again, but this time they were clearer. Voices of patients and doctors mixed in a chorus of despair. They let us die. They tortured us. The voices echoed in my mind, and I felt the pain and suffering they conveyed. I decided to continue, guided by the whispers. They took me to another room where I found more old files. Among them was a final report detailing the last days of the experiments. The document confirmed that many of the patients had been subjected to inhumane procedures and that most of them had not survived. The doctors tried to cover it up, but the truth was there, hidden in the forgotten files. As I was reading, I felt an icy hand on my shoulder. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there again. The whispers were louder now, and I could almost feel the presence of the spirits around me. They were trying to show me something I hadn't discovered yet. It was then that I found a diary, different from the others. This one seemed to be from the hospital director himself. His words were full of regret and fear. He described how the experiments had begun with good intentions, but had quickly spiraled out of control. The doctors, desperate for results, began to ignore ethics and morality, treating the patients as mere objects of study. The diary ended with a shocking confession. The director admitted that he knew about the horrors that were happening, but had chosen to turn a blind eye, fearing the repercussions for his career and the hospital. He mentioned that the spirits of the patients never left him alone, haunting him until his last days. With the diary in hand, I began to understand the true extent of the horror that had taken place on that floor. The doctors had not only failed to cure the patients, but had also brutally destroyed their lives. Restless spirits were trapped there, seeking justice and recognition for their pain. I decided that I couldn't just leave everything as it was. I needed to find a way to expose the truth, to give a voice to the forgotten victims. But at the same time, I felt the weight of fear and despair enveloping me. I knew I was dealing with forces I didn't fully understand, and that the road ahead would be dangerous. With the director's diary in my hands, I began to feel a deep hopelessness. The truth about what had happened on that floor was even worse than I could have imagined. The doctors, driven by ambition and desperation, had sacrificed so many lives in the name of science, and now the spirits of those patients were trapped, tormented by the pain and suffering they had experienced. As I tried to process all this, I began to feel the spirit's presence more intensely. The shadows on the walls moved, and the whispers turned into cries of pain and despair. It was as if the hospital itself was alive, breathing around me, pressing down on me with its oppressive atmosphere. I tried to stay calm, but the feeling of being watched and stalked was overwhelming. I began to see distorted reflections of myself in the windows and mirrors. In each one, my face was marked by terror, my eyes reflecting a deep, primal fear. The hallucinations became more and more real, and I felt I was losing my sanity. Fighting against the growing madness, I decided I needed to find a way out. I ran through the dark corridors, trying to find the staircase or elevator that would take me back to the real world. But it seemed that the hospital itself was conspiring against me. The doors that had once been open were now locked, and the corridors seemed to stretch on endlessly. Increasingly desperate, I began to hear the screams of the patients in my mind. Their faces appeared before me, their eyes full of pain and suffering. "Why have you abandoned us? Help us!" Their voices were like knives cutting through my sanity and pulling me into the abyss of despair. It was then that I felt a stronger presence behind me. I turned quickly and saw an indistinct figure, a shadow that seemed to pulse with evil energy. The figure had no face, but I could feel its anger and suffering. It was slowly advancing towards me, and I knew there was no escape. I started to back away, tripping over my own feet as the shadow drew closer. Every step it took seemed to drain my energy, my will to fight. My senses were in disarray and my mind was spinning in a whirlwind of fear and despair. All I wanted was to get out of that horrible place. But it seemed that the top floor of the hospital had no intention of letting me go. Finally, the shadow stopped a few steps away from me. I was trapped, with no way out. I could feel the cold emanating from it, penetrating my skin and freezing my blood. It was the height of terror, the embodiment of all the suffering and pain accumulated on that cursed floor. It was then that I heard one last message from the spirits. Go away, before it's too late. Their voices, although full of pain, seemed to carry a glimmer of hope that I could still escape. But I knew that getting out of there wouldn't be easy. I was on the edge, my sanity hanging by a thread. With the spirit's words echoing in my mind, I began to back away slowly, feeling that the shadow was getting closer and closer. The fear was almost unbearable, but I knew I had to get out of there before I lost my sanity completely. In a last desperate effort, I ran down the corridor, trying to find the staircase that would lead me out of that damned floor. The shadows on the walls seemed to reach out for me, as if they wanted to pull me into the darkness. The feeling of being watched and hunted was overwhelming. Finally, I saw the door to the fire escape. My heart skipped a beat, and I ran as fast as I could. I opened the door with force, and the metallic sound echoed through the corridors. I started down the steps, each step taking me a little further away from that hell. I reached the bottom floor, panting and in a cold sweat. I looked back, expecting to see the shadow following me, but there was nothing. The silence was oppressive, but at least I was off the top floor. I continued down until I reached the first floor, where the environment seemed safer, more real. I left the building and found myself on the sidewalk under the pale light of the street lamps. The cool night air seemed to dispel some of the darkness that had enveloped me inside. But I knew I would never be the same again. The visions, the screams, the distorted faces, all of it was etched in my mind forever. My colleagues at the hospital realized that something was wrong. They were worried about my condition, but I couldn't talk about what had happened. Who would believe me? And even if they did, what could they do? The top floor of the hospital would remain a place of pain and suffering. A tomb full of tormented souls. A few days later, I returned to the hospital to try to resume my routine. But every time I passed near the staircase leading to the top floor, I felt a shiver run up my spine. I knew that the spirits were still there, trapped in their eternal torment. The rumors about the top floor continued, and new employees received the same warnings I had received. No one else tried to get in, and the door remained locked. But I knew the truth. I knew that the evil that inhabited that floor would never go away. The hospital continued its normal activities, but for me, nothing would ever be normal again. I would carry with me the weight of the souls I met there, their stories of pain and despair. And even if the world moved on, the top floor of the hospital would remain a place of shadows, where the horrible past could never be completely forgotten.